The earlier video spent quite a bit of time looking at the relative power of suppliers and buyers in the firm's industry from the point of view of thinking about the market structures involved. So we, in particular, thought about the relative number of suppliers and what the market structure looked like there, and we compared that with the number of buyers in the firm's industry and what market structure that represented. Well, there are some other factors that are also going to influence the relative power of suppliers versus buyers. So let's just go through a few of them. A number of these are going to involve concepts that we've seen already in the course, but are just going to be applied to this particular situation. The first one that I'm going to think about here are the relationships between the suppliers and the buyers in terms of how dependent they are on each other. In other words, how diversified are their purchases or their sales, depending on whose point of view you're thinking about here. So let's think about it from the point of view of the suppliers. We could ask, how dependent is each individual supplier on sales to the firm? The logic here is really very straightforward and quite simple. The bargaining power of the supplier is going to go down the more they are dependent on sales to the firm. So, for example, let's just consider a simple case in which farmers have signed some contract to sell to a single company. Suppose our company was McCain's Foods, a large company here in New Brunswick. Potato farmers may well sign exclusive contracts to sell potatoes to McCain's, at least for a certain period of time. So those individual suppliers become completely dependent upon their sales to that one company. They might be able to break that contract, but perhaps at a significant cost. Another way that a supplier could become dependent on a firm is if that supplier has to invest in particular skills or particular kinds of equipment, let's say in order to make a specialized part that the company wants to buy. So once those investments have been made, then that supplier becomes very dependent on its buyer. So dependent, in fact, that economists have come up with a term to describe that dependence, or the danger of that dependence. It's called the hold-up problem. So the phrase hold-up sort of refers to being robbed by a robber or being held up. So the idea is that the supplier could become so dependent on the buyer that the buyer could say, well, we did have a contract, but let's talk about the terms. Perhaps now you would be willing to lower your price. And in such a situation, the supplier might not have much choice but to agree. Of course, that wouldn't be a very nice business practice and might get the firm a bad reputation among future potential suppliers. But it is at least theoretically a possibility. We can also think of another familiar concept, in this case, switching costs. So we can ask, how are the switching costs that individual suppliers face compared with those of the buyers in the market? Let's just consider a couple of examples. We could say that the supplier's bargaining power is going to go down, the more difficult it would be for that supplier to find a new customer. In other words, the higher the switching costs are going to be. And it sort of follows from the buyer's perspective that the supplier's bargaining power is going to be lower, the more easily the firm can find a new supplier. So, in other words, the lower are the firm's switching costs in leaving that supplier and finding another one. One example of this application of switching costs can be thought of if we think about a labor market. So economists think about labor markets as involving what they sometimes call frictions, but which are really costs of switching. So we could think of how difficult it would be for a worker to switch from one employer to another. In other words, from one buyer of their labor to another. We could think about it from the point of view of the firm who's hiring workers. How easy is it to switch from one worker to another? In other words, how easy is it to replace existing workers? So we could think about it in terms of workers' costs and difficulties in finding a new job. That involves time, searching for a new job, possibly moving to another place if the new employer is a long way away, and those costs could be really quite substantial. So the greater those costs are, the greater is the firm's bargaining power, all else equal. Firms can do something about that as well. They can increase those switching costs that workers face. In recent years, there's been a bit of a scandal in the United States about the way that businesses have been behaving. For example, I've read that workers who work at one McDonald's franchise are going to be unable to get jobs at another McDonald's franchise. These franchises, these different branches of McDonald's, have an agreement among themselves that they won't hire each other's workers. Well, that's just a way of really increasing the difficulty of workers to get a new job, because obviously if you've been trained and if you've had a job at one fast food restaurant, then you've got the skills to get the job at another one, but they don't want to compete against each other. Another way of doing this is for firms to require workers to sign labor contracts that prevent them from getting jobs with rival firms. The basic idea behind that, a sort of legitimate idea, is that a worker in your business might acquire sort of specific information about what goes on in your firm that might be of use to a rival firm. So you want to have some way of discouraging workers from quitting your firm and going to work for a competitor and taking valuable information with them. Another thing sort of along these lines that corporate power does in terms of lobbying governments is to do things like attempt to weaken unemployment insurance. So if workers lose their jobs, if you threaten to fire workers, for example, and they have a difficult time getting unemployment insurance, or if unemployment insurance is less generous, then it becomes more unattractive to lose your job, and that's going to increase the bargaining power of business over labor in general. Got an example here of a direct attempt to lower the bargaining power of workers. In this case, a famous example, Google and Apple made an agreement between themselves not to hire each other's engineers or other skilled workers. So some years ago, this was now 2007, if I look at the dates on this correspondence, a recruiter at Google called an Apple engineer to see if the engineer was interested in working for Google. Steve Jobs, who was the head of Apple at that time before his death, learned about this, and he phoned fellow Sergey Brin, I think, who was one of the co-founders of Google, and then he wrote an email to Eric Schmidt, the other co-founder of Google. And he said, Eric, I would be very pleased if your recruiting department would stop doing this. Thanks, Steve, says the note. And Eric Schmidt looked into this. You can pause the video if you like and read all the details. But essentially he said that this was a violation of their do not call policy. And he sent him a copy of the do not call policy and said that for violations of this do not call policy, anybody who does that is terminated at Google, and the person involved in this particular incident, he says, will be terminated within the hour. And he apologizes again, and Steve Jobs replies with a little smiley face that he's happy that their conspiracy is going to continue. Incidentally, this was stopped some years later by regulators who decided that this was an illegal practice.